Well, so Simon Johnson gives both explanations that I find interesting. One is that they contribute so much money to elections that they essentially buy elections, that they have gone up so enormously in their financial value. They're such an enormous percentage of the American economy that they have so much money that they're able to influence. Well, that's a traditional understanding. That's a traditional American political science understanding of what's going on. We're looking at interest groups, elections, pluralism, and so it's money in the economy. We all know that. I mean, it's kind of crony capitalism, but a different kind of crony capitalism. The structural argument is the other one, which is that it's not that they're buying elections, it's that the politicians are afraid that if the economy collapses, they will be severely punished by the voters. And that has nothing to do with their campaign contributions. I mean, when you think operationally of how does that work, the first one assumes that we can measure their behavior. It assumes that we can go out and look at campaign contributions, see how it works. So that's a kind of traditional, methodological, traditional way of thinking of it. The structural argument says, no, they have influence even if we can never find a dollar. Because we can't allow them to collapse, because if they collapse, the economy will be paralyzed, and the politicians are so afraid of that, they won't let us happen. So I think that's I find it very fascinating because, again, in this context of this room has people from all over the world, and which makes it interesting that our many intellectual traditions. My experience in Europe is that you can make structural arguments in Europe and nobody shows you the door. And you can do it in sociology and nobody shows you the door, but in American political science, if you make a structural argument, they'll show you the door. That's a very unpopular argument. The only serious political scientist who's pushed it was Lindblom. And one of the fascinating stories when Lindblom published Politics and Markets, which makes an argument of this kind. The Mobil Oil Corporation took out a full-page ad in the New York Times denouncing him for doing this. This is outrageous that people like this are teaching in American universities, and I think the discipline is similarly very fearful of arguments like this because it sees them as too hard to operationalize. So I think those issues are kind of very interesting analytically for us. What I find interesting is now in the discussion about too big to fail, which is happening all over the world. The countries are looking at their banking systems and thinking, is the real thing that if something gets that big, it cannot be allowed to fail because of its systemic effect. Then leads to a bunch of questions about what is too big to fail. And that then requires that we start looking at some microeconomic issues that are quite different. The distinction I want to make here is I've been reading about what caused the crisis. I see a very interesting division in the literature between the people who stress macroeconomic causes and the people who look at micro causes. Macro causes are familiar to you. I think they are things that you've all read about, which is tremendous macro imbalances. The United States runs enormous trade deficits, therefore it's importing an enormous amount of money from China. The Chinese are giving all this money. It's running a big budget deficit, so the American government gets more and more in debt. And finally, the problem of all this in debt creates a bubble. The housing bubble happens, but all that is driven by these macro conditions, right? In this analysis, the bubble is driven by macro conditions. And finally, people have been writing for years, this cannot last. I wish I had a column of Krugman's in which he said many times, this can't last, this can't last. I don't know when it's going to crash, but it will crash. And so that would be the macro explanation. And that's quite a different one from the micro. The macro, the leading advocate of the macro arguments that I know of is Jeff Frieden, who teaches at Harvard. He spends a lot of time here in Latin America, I think. And Jeff is about to come out with a book with a guy called Menzies Chin, which is really quite a wonderful book. And he really lays out extremely clearly the macro argument. Unfortunately, he's gotten criticism for it, so he's now softened it by putting in a micro argument, which is too bad because I was looking forward to being able to say, well, you've got this macro book, and now we can look at the micro books. But what the macro argument doesn't look at is whether there were features of microeconomic regulation in the United States and the other countries led to that, which made, there's certainly truth, if you're running deficits like that, you've got money pouring into the country. That money pouring into the country has to go somewhere. And Jeff's argument is, if you have that much money pouring into the country, you're going to get a bubble someplace. It doesn't matter where it is. Where it is detail. But the macro argument would say that there were a lot of regulatory things that were going on that could have sterilized or contained or neutralized all that money that was coming in, and those things were not done. And those micro things consist of things like, for example, the mortgage business, which was allowing mortgage, paying so little attention to mortgage regulation that you were allowing mortgages to get written when people were completely not creditworthy and the regulators weren't paying attention. You were then allowing things, you're allowing credit delivery, credit swaps, the derivatives being written on the basis of very bad mortgages. You were then allowing them to be sold, right? You wrote these derivatives, which is going to be sold as pieces of paper, which are then being bought all over the world because the credit rating agencies were giving them AAA ratings. They were being sold all over the world, and that's really what made this thing, which universalized it. If it had just been a mortgage crisis in the United States, it would have been a downturn, you know, a temporary downturn, but this disseminated everywhere because of those regulatory things. And I think one of the interesting moments that happened is that not only were you allowed, my colleagues in finance, if you complain about this, they say, but financial innovation is a good thing. We shouldn't be regulating these kinds of things because you want to encourage innovation in finance. But that's a really interesting idea right there because it goes to another distinction between the money economy and the real economy, because it really is privileging the virtue of the money. And there have actually been kind of amazing papers. Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize winning economist at MIT, wrote a paper just a few months ago about complaining about the real economy versus the money economy distinction, which I think is one that faded, at least in the US, for quite a period of time, and that too has come back in the crisis. But my answer to those people is, okay guys, I believe in innovation, I'm in favor. Markets are nice because they create new products like computers and cell phones and all that. But do you have to, these derivatives are completely untested. We've never tested them in a crisis. What you've been doing is allowing people to take these new instruments and use them in the reserve requirements of a bank. The bank, when it has to hold assets in reserve requirements, it's allowed to take these things and say, this is part of our reserves. But that's kind of an incredible thing to do, because you're taking this completely unknown piece of paper that's never been through a big recession and using it as a reserve requirement at the same time that the regulators are softening the ratios that are being required to be held for reserves, which was also going on, right? The regulators in the US, the high-tech guys would come in and say, oh, well, financial innovation is such that these new instruments have risk-free, they have no risk. So you have to allow us to count this. Anyways, you shouldn't be asking us to hold 20% reserve because we've got risk so much under control, but we no longer have to have that ratio. And the regulators said, okay. So that's just to give you some of the stories that are out there about a weakening of the regulatory apparatus. And I would say that that counts in the repertoire, that along with corporate governance system where you were giving tremendous payoffs to people taking big risks. And people are arguing that that system encouraged risk-taking at the expense of the shareholder. And there's a whole other bunch of interesting corporate governance issues that are being challenged about whether, in fact, paying people, giving executives bonuses and stocks really aligns their incentives with the shareholders, because that was the justification. Now people are saying, well, you know, there's many different kinds of shareholders. And some people have an incentive to take bigger risks than others do. My goodness, it's not bad.